Hi there. My name is Alex Kiiffner. I'm a podcast producer and host, and what you're about to watch is the first episode of a short podcast series. Over the next 6 episodes, we're going to take you through Ontario politics and make it easy to understand. We want you to get a little insight, and hopefully it makes you want to get involved, or at least pay a bit more attention than you used to. I hope you enjoy.
We are committed to ensuring that the 2015 election will be the last federal election using first past the post.
Deeply committed to. However, one of the things we saw is the range of different perspectives and priorities around reforming our electoral system.
These are all questions that we should be able to reflect on as a mature democracy, looking at what's working, what's not working around the world, what suits us.
The Prime Minister has long promised the 2015 election would be the last one fought under the first past the post voting system. Apparently, that's no longer the case.
I don't vote because I don't care about politics. That's what the CBC found to be the most common reason people don't vote. They were investigating after a series of elections in Canada showed that people across the country are essentially turning away from politics. Stats Canada did a study and found much of the same. On top of that, young people, more than any other group, said that they don't like the way that our voting system works. It feels like a vote doesn't matter. You can understand why. I mean, for the last 8 years, Ontario's had the same party in premier in power with no sign of fatigue from the people that like him. So if you don't like him, it may start to feel useless to vote. And the numbers back up the sentiment. In 2022, voter turnout was the lowest in Ontario's history, and 2025 was just barely higher. In both cases, less than half of the people that were able to vote actually turned up. Now, at least federally, there were efforts to change the system, but it didn't stick. So is it the system that doesn't work, or is it something else? That's what we're exploring today, and ultimately asking the question, why does it feel like voting doesn't matter? I'm here with Guelph MPP and leader of the Ontario Greens, Mike Schreiner, to help talk this through. How are you, Mike?
Pretty good, Alex. How about yourself?
Good. The first thing I kind of want to know is just a brief overview. Remind me, first past the post. What's the deal there?
Well, that's the voting system we have here in Canada. And if you look around the world, 80% of OECD countries have a different kind of voting system. So countries like Canada, the US, and the UK are kind of the exception to the rule when it comes to still having first past the post voting. What is that? I mean, the simple answer is whichever candidate in a riding gets the most votes, even if it's not 50% of the vote, and in most cases in Ontario and Canadian elections, the person elected doesn't get 50% of the vote, they still win because they're the ones who crosses the finish line or gets past the post, if you think of horse racing, first.
Is that where that comes from? Is it a horse racing thing?
That's where it comes from, yeah.
Okay, I see. That's cool.
And, but most of the time, I'm proud to say in Guelph, we're one of the exceptions, the candidate who wins doesn't get more than 50% of the vote. And when you look at the composition of the Parliament, whether it's the legislature in Ontario, Parliament in Ottawa, the governing party seldom has more than 50% of the total votes cast in an election. So oftentimes in Canada, a candidate can win their riding with somewhere 35-40% of the vote, and oftentimes a government can form a majority government, giving them 100% of the power, even though the party's aggregate vote is oftentimes 40%.
Right.
And so I think that's one of the reasons people feel like their vote doesn't count, because it's like, well, if 40% of the people voted, let's say, Conservative provincially and Liberal federally, and yet they have 100% of the power, that doesn't seem right when 60% of the people didn't even vote for them.
And why do we use this system? Where does this come from?
Yeah, well, I mean, historically, that's the way most democracies, a few hundred years ago worked. But, starting in the early 20th century, a number of democracies, particularly in European countries, started realizing that, especially as you saw more parties develop, that it just doesn't make sense to have majority governments that don't have a majority of the votes. Like, so how does that make sense? And so people started looking at different voting systems that would reflect the democratic will and wishes of the electorate, and that's why people started looking at voting systems like proportional representation, for example.
Right, and so in that system, it's more one-to-one, so the people that get a certain percentage of the votes get that much representation?
Yeah,
Closer
I mean,
to it?
generally, that's why it's called proportional.
Yeah.
Is that if your party gets 40% of the vote, you get 40% of the seats. If you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats.
And does it have the same idea of ridings? And
in most proportional representation systems, it does. There are a few exceptions to that rule, and those that are exceptions to that rule tend to not function as well. And those are the ones that critics of proportional representation usually point to
right.
As not working as well. But there are a number of models where you have proportional representation in the legislature that reflects the democratic will of voters, but you still have a member of parliament or provincial parliament that is the representative of a riding or an electoral district or whatever the name is for it. Because I do think, and I can tell you as somebody who is an MPP, that this is important. It's important for constituents to have a member of parliament to go to when they need things. Like my office, my constituency office, we do tons of work for people in a nonpartisan way. Just helping them get a driver's license or access to health care, find housing or whatever. And I think that work is critically important. So I think most Canadians want to make sure they have an MPP that represents their community to do that kind of work. But at the same time, they'd also like to see a parliament that actually is democratic.
So do you think that we should keep first past the post? I mean, what do you think about it?
I don't think we should. So you talked about the 2015 federal election, and that was an election that at the time Justin Trudeau promised to end first past the post electoral system, and I won a majority government, I think partly on that promise, and then broke the promise, unfortunately. But he formed that majority government with like 40% of the vote. And so if you're a conservative or an NDP voter or a Green voter or a Bloc voter or People's Party voter, you weren't very happy. Like, how come he gets a majority government with only 40% of the vote? That doesn't seem right. And then 3 years later, Doug Ford won a majority government in Ontario with like 40% of the vote. And if you looked at how low the voter turnout was, only about 17.5% of people in Ontario voted Conservative in that election. And yet the Conservatives have a majority government with 100% of the power and can kind of do whatever they want to do. That doesn't seem very democratic to me. And I think that's one of the reasons people are starting to lose confidence in our democracy. And one of the reasons you're seeing voter turnout going down, because people are like going, this government doesn't represent what I want, or it's actually making my life worse. And they didn't even get a majority of the vote. Like, how is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, 100%, and depending on where you live, that's the biggest thing. And you see a lot about strategic voting coming around, and that's, you know, people don't really feel good about that, I think.
Well, I think strategic voting is a sign of how broken the system is. Because instead of voting for who you want, or voting for a party or a person that reflects your values and who you think would be the best voice for you at Queen's Park or Parliament in Ottawa, you tend to vote against somebody and you choose the lesser of two evils instead of what you actually want. And so because of that, we oftentimes in Canada don't get governments that people actually want. And that's when you start seeing cynicism develop. That's when you start seeing people say that, democracy isn't working. And I think that's really dangerous. And so if you look around the world, governments and societies that have proportional representation, they tend to rank very high on indexes of democracy. So like the VDEM Democracy Index will rank proportional representation systems much higher in terms of democratic accountability, democratic values, and they tend to rank countries like Canada, the US, and the UK, who still use the outdated, centuries-old first past the post system, to much lower. And the other thing that oftentimes happens is, and I know this is a big issue, especially here in North America, is we're seeing increasing polarization, especially in the US, but you're starting to see it drift up here into Canada as well. That's very common when you have first past the post systems where it's like this side versus this side and these folks are evil. But in proportional representation systems where you maybe have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 parties, and because no party gets a majority of the vote, parties have to work together with each other. And so there tends to be less polarization, more cooperation. Economic growth tends to be higher. They tend to be more fiscally responsible, better environmental protections. So better outcomes for people in society in places where democracy is stronger. And that tends to be in places with proportional representation.
In proportional representation, is there a way that a party could still have that takeover majority government formed?
Oh, 100%. If they get over 50% of the vote, then they have a majority government. So there's nothing in a PR system that prevents majority governments. It just tends to be oftentimes it doesn't lead to that. But I mean, think about Canada, or let's look at Ontario. We have 4 parties elected in the Ontario legislature. So when you have 4 parties running in every riding, and then there's oftentimes a number of other parties that don't have seats in the legislature, but could grow and have seats in the legislature on the ballot. So, oftentimes you'll have 6, 7 candidates on the ballot. So it's hard to get about 50% of the vote. But then that means the vote starts to become more fragmented. And that's why you tend not to have majority governments in systems with proportional representation. But what happens with first past the post when you have a number of parties like that, which I think makes democracy stronger and better when people have a party that really represents their voice, you tend to have what's called false majorities. And that's when you get this situation where Doug Ford, has 100% of the power with 40% of the number of votes cast, but only 17, 18% of the overall vote because so many people don't vote because they don't feel like their vote counts.
So you said 17 to 18% of the total votes.
Yeah, so of all eligible voters in Ontario, Doug Ford in the 2022 election, for example, where we had very low voter turnout, received about 17% of eligible votes in Ontario voted Conservative in that election.
Wow.
Yet he had an overwhelming majority government with a 100% of the power to do whatever they want. And I'm thinking 80% of people aren't represented by this government, yet they have 100% of the power. How is that democratic? And so then you start understanding why so many people feel like democracy doesn't work for them or that what's happening at Queen's Park doesn't represent what they want. And so that's when you start seeing even fewer people vote. And then, when you start seeing undermining of democracy, that has huge implications on our economy, affordability, housing policy. My gosh, how many people in Ontario can't afford housing? And they want action on the housing crisis. And yet the Ford government hasn't been taking action on the housing crisis because, they only have to get 17, 18% of people voting for them. And so they're going to represent the views of those folks, which in this case tend to be, existing homeowners and not people who are struggling to pay rent or even think about being able to buy a home.
And those voices that are voting, the fewer people that vote, the more their vote matters, or it impacts too, I guess. They have more overall power. So if you stick with it, then you end up having a larger proportion of 17% of.
That's right. But I will say that even though in this particular case you would argue that Conservatives are benefiting in Ontario, but you can say the same thing federally. What was it? 2 elections ago? Yeah, two elections ago. The Conservative Party actually got more votes than the Liberal Party, but the Liberal Party formed a minority government because they elected more seats. So how's that fair to Conservatives? So it's not just something that's unfair to, let's say, Greens or NDP or Liberals. Also, sometimes it depends on where you live. So in the city of Toronto, for example, most ridings go Liberal or NDP.
Right.
So Conservative and Green voters don't feel like their vote counts in the city of Toronto. So fewer and fewer of them oftentimes vote. You go into rural ridings that tend to usually vote Conservative, and even though there are a number of NDP or Liberal or Green voters there, they oftentimes feel like, well, does our vote really count? And so one of the things that proportional representation does is it ensures that every vote counts, regardless of where you live. And then that gives an incentive for people, even who live in a community that may vote Green, but it gives a Liberal, NDP, and Conservative the incentive to go out and vote because they know that vote will contribute to the proportional share of their party's vote. And That encourages more voter turnout, makes every vote count, and just strengthens democracy for everyone.
Right, and I just want to touch on, I just want to go back again just to make sure I understand the proportional representation aspect of it. So when you vote in a proportional representation system, you have an MP in your riding, or MPP in your riding, and you vote for them. And that, how does that affect the overall wider picture?
So there are different types of proportional systems.
Right.
So one, and this was recommended by a group of citizens in Ontario in 2007, which would be mixed member proportional representation is what it's called, is in this particular case, let's say you vote conservative. And you elect a conservative member of the Ontario legislature. So that vote would contribute to your local person, but would also contribute to a vote proportionally to ensure that if 40% of people vote conservative, 40% of the members of the legislature would be conservative. So in this particular case, you'd have people in your riding as your riding representative, and then you would have some additional MPPs elected to have it reflect the democratic will of the people of Ontario. Now, there are other systems of proportional representation. There's something called single transferable vote, where you have regions, and you might have a region where 5 ridings are represented, and you would rank your preference. You know, maybe Green is number 1, and Conservative is number 2, NDP is number 3, Liberal is number 4, and then the votes in that region would be distributed proportionally to elect candidates. So there's a lot of different systems. I'm less concerned about the details of the system, frankly, and more concerned about the fact that we have a proportional system that strengthens our democracy, makes sure every vote counts, and ensures that our legislatures represent the democratic will of the voters in Ontario and across Canada.
Now, you mentioned the citizens' recommendation, and you know, I've seen that you've spoken about a citizens' assembly before to do that. Can you speak a bit about that? What does that mean?
Yeah, one of the things I liked about what Ontario did in 2007 with the Citizens' Assembly is they randomly selected people from every riding in the province, and then they brought those folks together, and they met with electoral experts, they learned about different voting systems, they studied it intensely, and then came forward with a recommendation. And so what I like about that is it takes the politics out of it. And so, for example, Greens may want one system that we think benefits Greens, and Liberals may want another system that benefits Liberals, or Conservative, vice versa. And so rather than having people look at it through a partisan lens and have it driven by politics, why not have it driven by people and what's best for people, what's best for the citizens of the province? And I think that is what a Citizens' Assembly does, is to say, you know what? I, as a citizen, randomly selected from our riding, so you know the whole province is represented. We're going to go take the time to study and come forward with a recommendation that we think is best for the province of Ontario. And that's what a Citizens' Assembly does. That's what happened in Ontario in 2007. I thought the Citizens' Assembly came up with a fantastic recommendation that I certainly could support and vote for. But unfortunately, the government at the time set a high threshold above, so you had to have a supermajority rather than just a majority vote. And the voters didn't quite reach that supermajority. Other countries have done other things, like they've sometimes used the Citizens' Assembly and then said, okay, let's try this system and give people a chance to see what it's like, and then they vote on it in the next election. That's what New Zealand did, for example. So there are many ways you can come up with what is the best system, and to be honest, there is no perfect system. Like there won't be, nothing in life is perfect, right? But I think having an electoral system that ensures every vote counts and that everybody knows their vote matters and reflects the democratic will of the people will strengthen our democracy, and any study will show you lead to less polarization in politics, more cooperation and collaboration, better economic performance, better environmental protection. So there's a whole host of benefits that come with having a strong democracy that truly reflects what the citizens of that particular province, country want.
Right. So citizens' assembly, it's kind of like jury duty for democracy.
Yeah,
you go in, you
100%,
study, and you find a solution.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's cool. And I certainly agree that it'll never be a perfect system. People will always find a way to game it and figure it out. I feel like you always also have to keep changing and adjusting and fixing things as you go along. So
yeah, well, the world evolves. I mean,
Yeah.
I think our societies are much more complex now than they were 200 years ago, and I think that's why in a number of societies now you have more parties, because those parties reflect the complexity that exists in our world today. And so right now in Canada, we're operating in a 21st century complex world with a 17th century democracy, basically.
Yeah.
And I think it's time to update it, modernize it, and have it reflect the realities of life in the 21st century.
yeah, it's funny, any other thing from the 17th century, people say, why the heck would you keep using that? But they're can be very protective about the democratic system. What happened in 2015? You explained what happened in 2007. There was a supermajority needed. The vote didn't hit. That's why that system didn't go through. What happened to the Liberals in 2015? Why didn't that work why didn't they follow up on that promise?
Well, you want my cynical political view of why did it happen? I think it was the Liberals got a majority government and we're like, I guess we don't need proportional representation anymore. We like first past the post because we now have all 100% of the power with 40% of the vote. So why do we want to change it? What the government of the day said was that there was no consensus around what a new system would look like. But you know what? The Prime Minister Trudeau at the time, I think somebody counted like 1,800 times he said that we were going to end first past the post and promised in first past the post, received a majority government making that promise thousands and thousands of times, and then broke the promise. And I think that was sort of maybe the beginning of the end of majority government for the Liberals. They pretty much had minority governments ever since after that. And I think a lot of people felt betrayed by that, and I think that's one of the reasons that having something like a citizens' assembly is important, because it's really designed to take the partisan politics out of it. And when you have a majority government, most of the time, partisan politics rules the day.
Yeah.
And if they don't get what they want, then they're not going to go forward with it.
It's tough to go back on a system that just gave you ultimate power, I guess, is the end of it. Okay, so for first past the post, and kind of actually on the topic of strong government, what I kept seeing, people said, the reason first past the post is good is because it creates strong governments that can carry out efficient change and can also get voted out just as quickly. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I hear all the time, we need strong, stable majority governments. First of all, those governments oftentimes don't represent the democratic will of the population. And so you have a majority government with 40% of the vote. So how is it fair that 60+% of the people don't support the government, yet they have a strong majority to ram through whatever they want? And so, that leads to things like the Greenbelt scandal we had here in Ontario, or like the sponsorship scandal that happened with the federal Liberals back in the day. And so, how strong and stable is it? Research shows that in most democracies with proportional representation, actually the government tends to last longer than what you see in parliamentary democracies with first past the post. So if you look in Canada, federally at least, almost every election over the last decade, really, except for 2015, has led to a minority government. So it's not like with first past the post we're getting majority governments. We're just getting minority governments that don't reflect the democratic will of the population. And so why not, if we're a democracy, and we want our governments to reflect what the people want, isn't that what democracy is all about? Why not have an electoral system that leads to those outcomes? And then the other thing that oftentimes happens, even if you have shifts in government with proportional representation, you don't have what's called policy lurch. And so let me explain that to you. So let's take Ontario for an example. In 2018, when the Ford government was elected, they spent almost their first year just undoing everything the previous Liberal government did. And so think of the amount of money that was wasted, the amount of time that was wasted, the amount of, like, you know, instead of building something for the future, you're tearing something down and going backwards. And so those major policy shifts just tend to lead to lower economic growth, less fiscal responsibility and higher debt, more dramatic policy changes that create uncertainty for business investment and economic growth. Whereas if you have proportional governments, because they oftentimes require governing coalitions, that even when those coalitions switch and different parties are involved, you don't see like a dramatic shift. There'll be changes, obviously, and changes in direction, but it doesn't lead to, you know, spending all your time just undoing and dismantling everything the previous government did.
Obviously requires cooperation, which is a big thing, but you have to maybe even live up to the party that had put those things in. So you're not going to get your coalition if you don't, you know, respect and maintain what's already come before you.
Yeah,
that's
like
kind of
like the previous, like the party that maybe previously was in power might actually be a minority member of your governing coalition. So they're obviously not going to get everything they want.
Yeah.
But they maybe get a few things they want, or maybe they'll say, you know, hey, we'll support the government as long as you don't dismantle X, Y, and Z policies that are, you know, really important to what our voters want.
Do you think Canada's ready for it, though? Because when I hear about these coalitions, I think of the, you know, the Liberal NDP in the federal sense. They work together, and people were very angry about it. Said, "Oh, those NDPs keeping the government." So, do you think we're ready for that in Canada? You know, socially or whatever you want to call it, like.
Yeah, I think we're ready for it because I think the policies that coalition government was delivering is something people wanted. They wanted dental care. They wanted the beginning of pharmacare. They just didn't want the Trudeau government to be the ones delivering it. And so if the Trudeau government had lost and we had another minority government, we might have been in a situation where, you know, people still got the policies they wanted, but they got different leadership bringing forward and implementing those policies. And so I think we're ready for it. I think the fact that so many voters get so discouraged because they don't think their vote counts, and we're seeing such dramatic declines in voter turnout, tells you we have to do something to revitalize our democracy. Otherwise, we're going to lose it. Look what's happening in the U.S. right now. And one of the ways that we can strengthen our democracy, increase voter turnout, make people feel like their vote matters because it does, is to actually bring in a new voting system where every vote counts.
So what do we do about that? What's the next steps?
Well, I would recommend, let's have a citizens' assembly that studies the issue in a nonpartisan way that would bring forward recommendations of how we fix our voting system. I think what we saw in 2015 when you had one party controlling it didn't lead to a positive outcome, and I think a lot of people feel disillusioned by that process. Versus in Ontario, I think there were people who wanted proportional representation who felt disappointed that it didn't pass in the referendum, but I don't think anyone felt disillusioned by the Citizens' Assembly process that came up with a nonpartisan recommendation of how to improve Ontario's democracy.
Do you think that the current government will ever implement a Citizens' Assembly?
I don't think so. I think the current government likes having 100% of the power with 40% of the vote.
So that might be a blocker to seeing that.
Yeah, but let's hope that, one of my hopes is that after the next provincial election, maybe we'll have a minority government. And as part of that conversation is like, let's fix our voting system so democracy is stronger. I think we're at a real turning point right now in our societies where a lot of people feel like government doesn't make a difference in their lives. Politicians don't listen to them. I was just meeting with a whole host of people who are experiencing homelessness, and what I heard over and over again was like, nobody in government listens or cares about us. And I think part of that is a systemic problem with our voting system. And so I think we need a government that's going to listen to all citizens and empower all citizens and make sure all voices are heard, so we can address some of the big challenges we're facing, especially when it comes to the affordability crisis that's hurting so many, middle class, working, and lower income individuals in Ontario and across the country.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it. I mean, I think that really puts a bow on the issue, and hopefully you feel like you understand things a little bit better now. And in our next episode, Mike, we're going to explore a little bit of your day-to-day. What's going on down at Queen's Park? What do you do when you get elected? What happens then? So we hope you'll tune in then. And Mike, any final thoughts?
Oh, I say when you get elected, you get to work really hard for people, but it's the best job you'll ever have.
Fantastic. I can't wait to hear all about it.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Mike.